Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. Boris Tizengausen is with you. Today is May 16th. Here are the main news stories at this moment. Ukrainian drones continue to strike at the most vulnerable points of the Russian military-industrial complex and the Russian budget. Last night, our drones visited the Stavropol region of the Russian Federation right at the Nevinomysk Azot plant. And after that, a fire broke out in the large-scale ammonia production area. Let's watch a video to see how it happened.
На ДК рванули, походу. О, вообще не работает, ни единого выстрела не было.
And here's how local residents reacted to this event.
Ребятки, что-то азоту прям вообще херово. Что-то прям, ребятки, очень херово азоту.
Yes, indeed, Azot is down sick, a huge plant with a capacity of 1 million tons of ammonia per year, 1.5 million tons of ammonium nitrate per year, another 1 million tons of urea, and that's not all. In other words, it's a real city, not just a fertilizer plant. This ammonia, nitric acid, and ammonium nitrate, on one hand, they're civilian chemicals, but some of these products are used in the production chains for explosives and munitions. So Russian chemical enterprises supply components to factories that produce these explosives as well. It's also important to note that fertilizers are a significant export item for the Russian Federation. Russia produces about a quarter of the world's total ammonium nitrate. Overall, the blow is, of course, extremely painful for the Russian military-industrial complex, the Russian budget, and the Russian agricultural sector. So it's a kind of triple jackpot. By the way, for those of us from the Mesozoic era, like myself, for example, the word nitrate brings back some special memories. Back in the day, in the 90s, people used to soak newspaper in nitrate, dry it, then somehow get hold of some foil, and you could make wonderful little rockets that would shoot up with a distinctive whistle. Usually, these experiments took place somewhere in a vacant lot, but there was always some adult who would show up at the most crucial moment of the rocket launch, interrupt the experiment, and all the kids would scatter in different directions. And I remember a phrase. Whenever adults caught you doing something like that, they would always use this phrase. When the kids scattered, that adult would shout, "I know where your parents live." But I mean, we weren't living where our parents lived, as it turned out. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We're here fighting against Putin's propaganda. Let's do it together, so make sure you subscribe. And now here's some news that's really going to make Lukashenko nervous. Today, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces, with the call sign Magyar, wrote the following, I quote, Minsk's Gauleiter Lukashenko, we are tracking every Shahed drone that flies into Ukraine through Belarusian territory and every one of your military games. You can talk about neutrality as much as you want, but Belarus has already become an accomplice in the killing of Ukrainians. The formula is simple. A corridor for killers equals complicity equals the cash register. So, in other words, Magyar is directly telling Lukashenko that he will soon pay for providing the Russians with a corridor for the Shaheds. Yesterday, Vladimir Zelensky also spoke about a possible escalation from the Belarusian side. From Magyar, this warning sounds, in my opinion, like the last Chinese warning. Apparently, Lukashenko has decided to play with fire. Klubniliki forgot that since the beginning of spring, Ukraine has shut down 7 major Russian oil refineries, while Lukashenko only has 2. And the distances here are much shorter. I looked at the map, and not only are the distances shorter, but there are also far fewer air defense systems. So I checked the map. Do you know how far it is from the Ukrainian border to the Moser oil refinery? It's less than 40 kilometers. Putin is in a completely deadlocked situation right now. The Russian economy can't hold out much longer, so apparently they've decided to use everything they possibly can. Recently, Lukashenko met with Putin at the parade, and then they chatted on the phone as well. Apparently, the expired Draniki managed to scrounge up a bit of money for these new mischiefs, but he was given a very direct hint that if he tries it again, he'll get hit right in the tubers. Stories like, I'm an old and sick Belarusian pensioner, I have a little dog, I have sciatica, those tales won't help anymore. Well, Ukraine and Ukrainians are showing the whole world that you can and must fight the enemy, even if they vastly outnumber you in manpower and equipment. Our defenders are performing a true feat right now. In every episode, we have an important fundraiser for the defense forces of Ukraine, and today we are continuing to raise funds for drones and charging stations for the 37th Marine Brigade, which is defending the Donetsk direction. The soldiers have recorded a video message for you. Please take a look.
Мене звати тату Аня. Я громадянка Бельгія. Я служу у складу 37-ї бригади морської піхоти. Звертаюся до Борис Тізан-Озен та його підписників.
Ми є військовослужбовцями 37-ї окремої бригади морської піхоти зенітного ракетно-артилерійського дивізіону. Наразі маємо потребу у зенітних дронах у кількості 100 одиниць. Просимо про допомогу у Бориса Тізенхаузена.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
In the video is Anna. She is Belgian. She serves as a UAV operator in the 37th Separate Marine Brigade. Despite the fact that Anya has a prosthesis, she is very strong, very charismatic, and shows the whole world how to overcome difficulties. When the war began, Anna came to Ukraine. At first she was a volunteer, and now she serves in the 37th Brigade. Let's help the 37th Brigade, our Marines, and Anna. The link to donate is in the description. In the description of this video. There you will find Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. In every episode, I want to thank you separately for supporting Ukraine and our soldiers. Thank you so much. And if you're watching on another channel, there's always a QR code in the corner, which also leads to the donation page. Trump stated that the US will not defend Taiwan in the event of a war with China. He made it clear that Taiwan itself wants to get involved in a war, spoke out against Taiwan's independence, and called on Taiwanese chip manufacturers to move their factories to the US. I don't know what kind of war Taiwan supposedly wants to get involved in, probably against China, but to me that sounds extremely strange. And Donald Trump also announced that arms deliveries to Taiwan are currently on hold. That's exactly what was needed for Xi Jinping. Moreover, the Chinese leader raised this issue very persistently. Taiwan, and in fact forced Trump to make this statement. That is, he was very direct, saying, we need opposition, go ahead. Well, I don't quite agree with the idea that Trump gave up on Taiwan. For many years, the US has pursued, this kind of cunning, a synonym for crafty policy, a dual policy, trying to please both sides. They did not recognize Taiwan's independence. They supplied weapons to Taiwan, but at the same time made statements about their commitment to the One China policy. In other words, for decades, the US kept China on edge. They didn't promise that they would definitely go to war, but maintained this kind of strategic ambiguity. Beijing was not supposed to know at all whether America would intervene or not if something were to happen with Taiwan. But here, Trump made it clear he would not intervene. So Trump broke this uncertainty. He sends a signal. In other words, Taiwan is not an ally at all, just an expendable item in a big, beautiful, wonderful, marvelous deal with Xi Jinping. So essentially, this lever of uncertainty that for half a century the United States had been playing, Trump sold it. Business is business. Well, what else did you expect? Then here arises the main question. Trump, after all, constantly talks about reducing dependence on China, that China is in fact an opponent. But with Trump, sometimes it's an opponent, sometimes it's a friend, and so on. It all depends on how things go, David. Now, you're telling Taiwanese chip manufacturers to move their production to the US, but at the same time, Trump is only increasing this dependence on China. He went to China with top businessmen. It doesn't make sense. If China is your adversary and opponent, then why are you bringing them? This huge army of businessmen. If you want to enter the Chinese market, then in return you'll have to pay even more. There will be even greater dependence on China. Well, I think it's all much simpler. They just want money. And as for what this will lead to in the future, well, it seems to me that nobody really cares. Money, money, money. Once again, money. And as for China, in turn, they got a nice picture out of it. The American president didn't come as a leader of a containment bloc, but as a deal maker. There are no more strategies. That's it. No more planning. There are only deals. And now you can make deals with anyone. It turns out it doesn't matter. Friend, ally, enemy. What's the difference? If the enemy pays more, you can even sell out your ally. And the main question is, how do you negotiate in this world from now on? What if tomorrow someone comes and offers Donald Trump just a bit more for this deal? But that doesn't mean that China will start an invasion of Taiwan tomorrow. A full-scale operation against Taiwan is a huge risk. There's the sea, logistics, sanctions, a blow to the Chinese economy, and the likelihood of Japan and the US getting involved. Even with Donald Trump's rhetoric, let's not forget there's still Congress after all. So more likely in the near future, instead of an invasion, there will be pressure below the threshold of war. Military exercises will intensify. Blockade scenarios, cyber attacks, pressure on shipping, diplomatic arm twisting of Taipei. In short, all of this will happen. But Putin, by the way, is also rushing to China, flying on his 7-centimeter heels. He will be there on May 19th and 20th. By the way, I caught myself thinking that Donald Trump somehow manages to do everything to push America's allies, or former allies, toward closer cooperation with China. As an alternative to the United States, he does everything just for that. Now he's going to introduce some new tariffs against Europe just so they don't get too comfortable. He's the one pushing them, saying, go over there, go that way. I'm bad, I'm imposing tariffs, I'm withdrawing troops. I'll break up NATO and you can just go somewhere else. I won't point fingers at where exactly. Here's another interesting fact about this visit. A New York Post correspondent wrote that before boarding Air Force One to depart from Beijing, the entire American delegation got rid of all the items that had been given to them by Chinese representatives. Gifts, badges, pins, pens, some souvenirs, documents, everything was thrown into a trash bin right in front of the plane. The directive was absolute. Not a single item of Chinese origin was allowed to board the plane. So these precautions extended beyond just this visit. Members of the delegation left their personal electronic devices, some at home, some on the plane, right before the trip to China. Throughout the entire visit, they used only clean, disposable phones. Well, it's understandable here. The security protocol was as strict as possible, and for those who needed their phones during the flight, I think Donald Trump definitely brought his. These phones were kept in special cages, Faraday cages on board the plane. These cages blocked electromagnetic signals, preventing unauthorized interference, so that, God forbid, no one would think that someone was monitoring the phones of the American delegation. Meanwhile, Putin is making a futile attempt to remind the world that he too is great. Russia is also a superpower, but it all seems very unconvincing, and the world no longer really sees it that way. Just imagine for a second, imagine that Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, which, let me remind you, it inherited by the Russian Federation from the USSR. I think that if there were no nuclear weapons, Russia as we see it now would have ceased to exist a long time ago. In essence, all of Putin's power, all his threats, rest on the remnants of the Soviet legacy. This can be said not only about nuclear weapons, but about other weapons as well. And from time to time, the old man Kabayev tries to play to raise the stakes. And so Putin has signed a decree simplifying the process for residents of Transnistria to obtain Russian Federation citizenship. Very interesting. This comes against the backdrop of Russia recently allowing the use of its army to protect Russians abroad. The State Duma passed this law. So here are two events. Putin is simplifying the process for residents of the unrecognized Transnistria to obtain citizenship. And they confirm and pass a law on the protection of Russians abroad, allowing Putin to use the army for this purpose. What does this mean, I wonder? Well, the scheme here is absolutely clear. First, they hand out passports, then they claim they are obligated to protect their citizens with those passports. And then either a military presence appears or direct intervention takes place. By the way, Putin is not an innovator in this regard. Hitler justified his invasion of Europe in exactly the same way, by claiming to protect the German population in Czechoslovakia and Poland. That is exactly how Moscow acted in the unrecognized territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia before the 2008 war. A very similar scheme was used in Donbass, where the mass distribution of Russian passports became one of the elements leading to further annexation. Now, the underground conqueror is trying to apply the same logic to the unrecognized Transnistria, but I very much doubt that it will work, and perhaps the effect could be completely the opposite if Ukraine intervenes. Why is this important right now? That is, Transnistria is a frozen conflict with a small Russian contingent on the territory of the unrecognized Transnistria, right on the border of Moldova, right on the border of our Odessa region. The region has long been in the gray zone of Kremlin influence, but Russia does not have a direct land border with this enclave. But the very act of distributing these passports, here, propagandists have a wide range of options for the future. That is, they will say, that's it, yes, our Russian guys, our children Russians are there. But it's important to understand that in the unrecognized Transnistria, many people already have Russian passports. That is, A census hasn't been conducted there for a long time, but according to various estimates, there are about 360,000 people. That's the population. And many of them have 3 or even 4 passports: Moldovan, Ukrainian, Romanian, and Russian. More than 200,000 residents have Russian passports. So, in other words, the formal pretext has existed there for a long time already. And here, Putin is simply raising the stakes in the information space. At the same time, we're not talking about an immediate invasion. Putin right now, he'd rather just somehow get out of Ukraine, where he's getting hit over his bald head every day. But there's another important point. Right now, Russia is trying to show that despite the war in Ukraine and the colossal losses, Russia still maintains influence in the post-Soviet space. So we've brought this lever up again, a lever. Well, against this backdrop, Transnistria becomes a symbolically important project for Putin, an attempt to show that the Russian world is still alive somewhere out there. Although, a series of failures, including in Hungary. The recent failure, so this series of failures shows that, well, the influence has really weakened. The Kremlin's influence. And of course, it's important for Putin to show that he's like this Botox jellyfish who dyes his eyebrows with brown mascara. Leningrad, he's still such a macho guy. Look, I'm going to scare everyone here again. In my opinion, now is the perfect time for Moldova to ask Ukraine for help. Since the Russians who are stationed in Transnistria are guarding this huge weapons depot, it's a problem for both Ukraine and Moldova. By the way, about those discarded Chinese souvenirs, maybe it wasn't worth throwing them away. Maybe they should have kept a couple and fed them disinformation if there really were listening devices inside. But this reminds me of a very interesting story. Perhaps you've read about it. It's one of the most famous episodes. One of the most famous Soviet intelligence operations of the Cold War was the story of the bug hidden in the Great Seal of the United States. This listening device was only discovered by the Americans many years later, in 1945. A group of Soviet schoolchildren from the Artek camp ceremoniously presented the U.S. ambassador to the USSR, Averell Harriman, with a large wooden Great Seal of the United States. It was a carved wooden plaque, round in shape, and everything looked like a gesture of friendship after the joint victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. So the ambassador hung this gift in his office in Moscow. And this is where things get really interesting. Inside this eagle, more precisely in its beak, was hidden a unique eavesdropping device. It was created by the Soviet engineer Lev Terman, the very inventor who came up with the musical instrument, the theremin, Terman Vox. This device was called Zlatust. There were no batteries or power wires inside. It did not emit a constant signal. That's why it couldn't be detected for many years. Soviet operators simply directed a special radio signal at the embassy from outside the building. A special radio signal from outside would cause the membrane inside the device to vibrate from conversations in the office, reflect the altered signal, and then transmit it further. The Americans deciphered it, but for 7 years they didn't notice this bugging device. Only in 1952. It was accidentally discovered during a radio frequency check, and when they found it, they just called it a gadget. This device was a truly unique invention, ahead of its time. The incredibly talented developer Lev Terman, there will be a very interesting story about how the state treated him a bit later. So it was a British radio operator who discovered this gadget. The British embassy was about 700 meters away, and in 1952 he suddenly heard conversations of American diplomats on that frequency, from this very device called Zlatust. If I were Donald Trump, I would now thoroughly inspect the portrait that Putin gave him, because Putin is just the absolute worst scoundrel. But the story of the inventor himself is even more interesting. Lev Terman, a spy who for a long time was believed to be dead in the United States, worked for Soviet intelligence. He was the person who invented this unique musical instrument, which is played by moving your hands in the air, essentially without touching it. In other words, a man adored by Einstein, a man respected by Chaplin. In 1927, the Soviet Union sent him to America to showcase the achievements of Soviet science. In reality, of course, it was to spy. And he did spy brilliantly. He rented a 6-story mansion on 54th Avenue, a studio where all of New York's elite would gather, a millionaire's club. In other words, Theremin was a real star. Even Einstein visited him, but Theremin fell in love. He fell in love and married a black ballerina. And in 1930s America, that was practically a sentence. Doors slammed shut. He was immediately ignored. The informants he had disappeared. Moscow was furious. How could you destroy such a network just for love? And in 1938, according to one version, Theremin returned to the USSR on his own, out of a sense of duty, but according to another version, he was simply taken away by force. And so the West decided he disappeared in an instant. The West decided that Theremin was dead. Where did he go? Back home, he was met by prison. He was sentenced to 8 years in the camps for espionage. Strange, isn't it? For espionage, even though he himself was spying for the Soviet Union. Later, he was assigned to the so-called NKVD Sharashka. This was a bureau where talented people worked. Tupolev and Korolev worked there as well. And Theremin began to create unique things there. It was there, behind bars, that he created this masterpiece. He even received the Stalin Prize after his release. Decades in the shadows, working for the KGB, complete obscurity. And then, a journalist from the New York Times wrote an article titled "Theremin is Alive." In the US, he was considered dead. He had simply disappeared, and no one knew where he was. Invitations poured in from all over the world, but who would let him go? As they say, he settled for a small salary somewhere, worked for a while, then was fired from there. His developments were discarded, he was thrown out. By the way, he developed a synthesizer which he created before anyone else, but later it was released by Yamaha. And Lev Theremin died in 1993 in Moscow, in a communal apartment near the Cheremушki market in poverty at the age of 97. His homeland did not remember him, did not appreciate him, a genius, a spy, a prisoner, an inventor, a man betrayed by the country he served all his life. If he had stayed in the USA, he would have been happy, teaching at a university somewhere, living well with children and grandchildren, and he would have been featured in every scientific publication. But this is how he was treated. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And I ask you very much, let's help our Marines from the 37th Brigade. Our help is very much needed by them right now. The link to donate is in the description of this video. Wishing everyone a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.